Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reality. My name is William, and I'm here with Lev.
Hi, everyone.
Our topic today is women's sports and the issue of transgenders in women's sports. We want to focus on the sports aspect of this issue. We're not really concerned about transgenderism in general, but we do want to address some current news stories about transgenders in female sports and some of the responses to that. For example, Mississippi recently banned transgender women in female sports, and President Biden has issued an executive order regarding transgenders and people who identify as the opposite sex in school sports. Do you have anything to add to that brief intro, Lev?
I think that's a good way to frame it. We're not trying to understand about the medical issues of transgenderism, but we're just talking about how, in what ways we should consider if transgender women can join in with female sports.
Right, because I think we both kind of agree on the biology. So
Yeah.
we're just going to move on and talk about the sports. So one of the big issues is trans women who are winning female sports competitions. One example is Rachel McKinnon, who kind of started the whole controversy by winning a cycling competition. And Rachel is a trans woman. And then Martina Navratilova criticized the idea of trans women competing in women's sports. So there was a controversy there. And then there was an issue with some Connecticut high school girl who sued the state because of a trans woman winning all the medals. So in general, do you have any ideas about whether this is a good policy to let trans women in female sports or not?
Well, it really depends entirely on the reason there's even different categories of sports there. Why do we even need a male sport and a female sport there? It would be a matter of, say, are there an equal playing field or comparable playing field? Because you would wonder about, say, strength, because there's like genetic differences in terms of, even just in terms of gender, about if you're stronger or not. I mean, testosterone has a big impact on strength, being more significant than people might realize, that it really affects your ability to perform in sports. And even if you're transgender, regardless of your view on it, when you're changing your gender, whether it's through hormone treatments or sex reassignment therapy or surgery, whether or not you've been on hormones long enough really affects whether you're still having the strength effects or not. Because if you imagine somebody just simply transitioned immediately, had surgery and didn't have any hormone changes, they would be stronger naturally than all other women, even if they're trans women. They would just have too much strength in their body left over from the testosterone and all that. And it wouldn't make sense to there would be no competition, like say weightlifting, for example. That if there wasn't enough time after taking hormones, you would have just a natural advantage without any training involved.
I think that the strength issue is critical in several sports, such as weightlifting. And in fact, weightlifting is one of the sports where there's a controversy. There's a trans woman, Laurel Hubbard, who won some international competition and criticized for taking medals away from actual biological women. And the USA Powerlifting Organization, they put out a statement about that. They don't let trans women compete in women's weightlifting because they said, quote, men naturally have a larger bone structure They have a higher bone density and stronger connective tissues and higher muscle density than women. So these traits, even with reduced levels of testosterone, do not go away. Close quote. So they took a pretty strong stand on it. That's the powerlifting organization, and in that organization, they have a competition called deadlifting, where you just basically lift as much weight as you can off the floor up to your hip. And this competition can show you the great difference between a man and a woman in strength. The top deadlifter, there's two who have lifted over 1,100 pounds, Eddie Hall and Thor Bjornsson. That's 1,100 pounds. It's like half a ton. And the closest female, the top female in deadlifting, only lifted 672 pounds. So that's almost like 400 or something pounds less. So that gives you an indication of at the top level of a sport, the difference between female and male strength.
Yeah, that's a big difference.
And in other categories, you can see this difference as well. Just in like a normal weightlifter, I read an article about this British rapper named Zuby, and he did a stunt online where he identified as a female for the time he was lifting weights. And he's just a normal weightlifter in a gym. He's not like a top level weightlifter. And he decided he would just try to crush all the female records, and he did in this video he posted. So that just shows you that just an average weightlifter can beat the top level females. So there's a great difference in strength, and there might be differences in other areas between the sexes too. For example, you don't see many females in Little League baseball, even though Little League for a long time has allowed girls in baseball. So one exception was the pitcher I forget her name, Monet Davis. In 2014, she made it all the way to the Little League World Series and actually won a game. So she got a lot of notoriety for that. But I followed up on her story, and the boys gradually became more skilled at baseball than her, and now she plays softball. So you can see how before or just during puberty, there might be some close resemblance between skills and sports abilities. But as you get older and mature and develop, the male becomes dominant in many sports.
Yeah, I would point out that it's not even so much that you're pointing out if they're male or female, as much as looking at the causal factors of strength and why you even have different leagues. If there was no causal factor of strength, there would be probably no particular reason to say trans women can't join female sports. But the strength we're looking at, the measurement we're looking at, is something to do with testosterone or whatever hormone affects strength. In which case we're not even just judging gender per se, but a specific kind of measurement. Because you could argue that trans women are in a separate category and they might not necessarily have a strength improvement precisely because of the treatments they're going through. But if you have a certain level of testosterone, it would indicate actually what levels of strength you could achieve and whether you're not even in the same league. It's not even just more like a weight class in boxing that, yeah, sure that men tend to weigh more, but what you're really looking at is like the overall bulk or average measurements and the way you have leagues. Like sure, maybe sometimes a lower weight class can beat a higher weight class, but you have different leagues for a reason, that you're trying to have a certain level of competition. You could cross the league sometimes, but that's not why you have different leagues. It's because you want a comparable level of competition.
Right. That gets me to another point I was going to raise is the reason why you have different classes in sports is to narrowly define champions within particular classes of ability or skill or strength. So you have different males of different sizes, and so you have different weight classes in boxing. You have different levels of ability between males. So you have little league, high school, semi-pro, pro baseball leagues. You want to find you want to group them according to whatever skills or abilities are relevant to that sport. And in many sports, sex might not be relevant. I think there are some sports where men compete with women in like a co-ed league. I don't know if like maybe curling or some sport that doesn't involve a lot of physical strength. Probably like poker tournaments, anyone can join.
Right.
Things like that, where it's mostly skill, through your thinking ability. You don't need to overpower your opponent.
Even racing. I mean, there's women racers and they're not in a separate league. I mean, they compete with the men just like anyone else. Because, well, obviously there is no meaningful distinction for the performance of the sport between the genders.
In a lot of sports where there's no danger of a female getting hurt, because one of the problems with letting females into male sports is that they can get hurt because a male can physically dominate them and injure them. That's a fear with trans men going into male sports. But in a lot of sports where it's just not a problem, where it's not dangerous for them, they do allow women in male sports. So there's no restriction on that. And that's because we recognize that males are dominant. And if a female can get into that sport, she's an exceptional female and should be able to rise as much as possible in her sport.
Yeah.
But going the other way, the opposite direction, you start noticing restrictions, and that's because a trans woman is stronger than a normal biological woman.
Right. I mean, I think that's reasonable enough. It's not even, and some people might even say that's transphobic, even though, because you want to keep them out, but it's not even because they're trans. It's just some meaningful measurement of sports here, which is strength. I mean, that's a meaningful distinction in how you judge people. I want to bring up a possible counterpoint, though, that imagine was a different category. Say, why would it be appropriate to just not allow people to simply identify as something and join that sport? Like, maybe you not even identify, but say it was about, say, by race. You might say that for whatever reason that a lot of Black players in basketball, I mean, they seem to be the best. And you could argue, I could imagine a race realist arguing that it's not fair that Black people are in a co-racial or a multiple racial league because there's an unfair advantage. And they would say, oh, you can't. They make a white league. They say Black people can't join. I mean, in some way, like, it would seem immoral to, like, if you're Black, to say you can't join a league just because you're not white. I mean,
yeah, I understand what you're getting at. And I think one of the big examples in history is Jackie Robinson entering the Major League Baseball. And the point I want to make here is that you have different levels of competition, and Major League Baseball was the top level of competition. So what's the point of having the top level of competition if you don't let the best baseball players into that level?
right.
When they had back then it was called the Negro League, they had the best Black players in the Negro League, why couldn't they get? Why shouldn't they be allowed to rise to the major league level? Because just because their skin color, it doesn't make any sense. If the point is to find the best baseball players, then it shouldn't matter what color they are, because what does color have to do with your ability in baseball?
Right.
So that you could apply that to any other level. Like if it's little league baseball, you want to know who the best little leaguer is. So you wouldn't want to segregate by color. That's ridiculous. There's no advantage or disadvantage to your skin color in baseball. And I can't see an advantage in any sport. Can't think of one.
Yeah, I think the reason you couldn't really find an advantage is because there is a significant overlap in abilities between races, that it's hard to find any like statistically meaningful difference between them. It's like just like the same strength essentially. But when you have a different category, like gender, there is significant distinction. There isn't much overlap between the genders in terms of strength in sports. They seem to naturally divide themselves up, just in terms of like you were saying about the difference between the top male lifter and top female lifter. There's a big gap between the two. And it's just because of a natural significant distinction. It's not just like there's some overlap, but there's some distinction, but there's mostly overlap. In many fields, that's true. There's significant overlap. Like with poker, there isn't any significant overlap in potential for male and female players. But in baseball, sure, there would be, because strength, there is some significant distinction between male and female performance due to testosterone or whatever it might be.
So there is a significant difference in performance at the top levels. Like sure. I'm not denying the fact that some men are pathetic at baseball, and
right.
you could have a lot of women who are better at baseball than him. But what we're focused on is, rising to the top, figuring out who the best players are in that sport. When you have that level of competition, you want to let anyone there. You want to doesn't matter race or sex or whatever. Right. But then you start dropping down the levels, and you get to, and then how do you divide the lower levels? Because you want to find you want to have lower leagues for development, and how do you segregate those classes of people? And I think one of them should be that you put women together, because you want to know who's the best woman, and you want to separate them by age, because you want to know who's the best child, or who's the best young adult. So I think that's kind of why I'm really against trans women in women's sports, because women's sports is already below the top level. Any man who wants to compete should be in a lower male league. So there's like male semi-pro. Yeah. He should just go in that league.
Yeah. That would make sense. Just go in that league. But what about the other way? Like, should trans women be in male sports? Then in that case, if they can't join the women's leagues, is the men league appropriate? I would say so. It's appropriate. What would you say?
Yeah, if they can compete.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you let a trans woman into a male league?
Right. I feel that way too. I think if it were transphobia in somebody's motive here, and the reason, they would say, well, no, they can't join even the male leagues. I think that would be almost hypocritical, but I think it's fair enough to say that, yeah, if you've got that, if we're saying that they have some advantage, then absolutely they should be able to compete in the male leagues, even if it's like an exception, even still, they feel they should have definitely qualified for that as far as the measurement of, say, testosterone or hormones.
So at the root of my position is that women's sports is for women. If you're gonna call it women's sports, it has to be for female human beings, because that's what a woman is. A woman is a female human being. So if you're gonna let men, biological men, into female sports, you can't call it female. You can't call it women's sports anymore. It's co-ed sports.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is essentially what the top level of any male-dominated sport is. It's co-ed, because if there was a badass woman who could play professional baseball, they would let her in. You know, she would be a spectacle. She would draw crowds. You know, it would be something to see.
Yeah.
Basically, concrete evidence of, you know, men being more dominant in sports, or at least certain sports, is that there's no women in baseball. There's no women in football. You know, certain sports, there's just women can't compete.
Yeah. I'm thinking that as far as trans women, as far as sports goes, trans women are definitely distinct from just male or female, because it's some different category. I'd say you can't treat them identically as a typical woman in many ways. I mean, you can't say they're the same as women, because, I mean, there's something different if you're a trans woman. You can't simply say trans woman, therefore women's leagues. I think you have to look into the unique nature of a trans woman. Why do we not simply say they're women? I mean, I guess some people say that's transphobic, but they're different people. They're different kinds of people. A very unique experience in their lives. We can't just call them women, nor could we really probably call them men. They're trans women, and that makes them in a unique position. So I think it's fair to judge them a bit differently than you would males or females, especially when it comes to sports. It would only make sense that you try to put special consideration. Say, do they belong in women's leagues, or is it more appropriate for a men's league? That's the sort of question I think is appropriate to ask.
Well, yeah, it's definitely an interesting question. The way I resolve it in my mind is that it's not really about the sexes. It's about levels of competition. And first, we break it down in like age groups, because that's the basic level of physical ability. You get stronger as you grow older. So you have certain age groups of competition, and then within those age groups, you start noticing differences between men and women.
Would you say, though, that as far as the Mississippi law, do you think Mississippi, as the government, should have any say in this? Or why should Mississippi have any say in what the schools do? What's your take on that?
Yeah, it's always an issue when government gets involved in such things. Of course, as an objectivist, I don't think government should be involved in schools, but since they are, I think they need to take a rational approach to this, just like any private school would have to do. And the rational approach, in my view, is to recognize that women's sports are for women. If you don't want to have a women's sports, then don't have it. Don't call it women's sports. But it's basically a linguistic problem to call women's sports if you're going to let trans women in. Mm-hmm. You should call it something else. It's disingenuous. It's trying to fake reality. It's trying to say, we have this women's sports program, and they're all women, you know, but it's not true. You're letting in males.
Well, I don't like the characterization personally that just men are trying to join the sport. I still like the distinction of trans women are want to be led in female leagues, and I think that's inappropriate, but I don't. Well, I guess it's just a conceptual disagreement here that I don't want to say that they're men in acting as women, but specifically trans women with a unique identity and as far as gender identity and the way they are psychologically. Psychologically different in the sense that if you have an identity and feel a certain way, then feeling out of place is also a psychological identity, like how you feel who you are. But aside from that, I mostly agree with you that insofar as schools are publicly operated, it does make sense to have some policy about how to treat transgender players in sports, in what way they should be in different school leagues. But I differ in saying that I think as far as the public schools, it should be district by district. The district itself should decide rather than on this level of state legislature. I think that's more rational than just going to the state level. I think these sort of issues are often best left to the local level because of how divisive they can be. I think often it'd be more effective and useful in the long term to just go by the local level first.
I think that would be a good policy if we didn't have public education.
Sure.
But we do have public education, and so we have laws, regulating what public schools can do.
True.
And one of the laws is a Title IX, which says you can't discriminate in school sports based on sex. So
right.
That was the issue with the girls at the Connecticut high school. They're claiming that they're being discriminated based on their sex. So that's a problem, and that's why I think some of these states that are passing laws against transgenders in sports is some of those laws I think are appropriate given the sort of public education system we have.
Mm-hmm.
But I do agree with you that if everything was private, it would be up to the school. The school would determine what they wanted to do with sports.
For sure. I think we've covered everything that we could so far. I mean, I know there's always more to talk about with transgender issues. I think this is a pretty good topic to condense things down to important issues rather than always the issues of simply politics, but like how do we deal with transgender issues in real life? Regardless of your position, you should still have some thought or belief about how to deal with sports. I think that's important. But other than that, I think we've covered a lot today.
Yeah, I think we did a good job focusing on the sports aspect of this issue. I think we do have some disagreement on the psychological issue, psychological versus biological.
Right.
But we'll have to save that for some other time because that's a whole nother topic.
Yeah.
Thanks for the conversation. I think it went well.
Yeah. Thanks. Bye, everyone.